Hello. Before we begin, a quick note. The Boy to Sleep podcast relies on you and sponsors, which means you will hear a quick advertisement before the beginning of tonight's episode. While the podcast is free, you are welcome to subscribe for just $2.99 per month, which supports the creation of this podcast and gives you an ad-free listening experience. Simply click the link in the show notes from your podcast app. Rest easy. Hello. Welcome to the Bore You to Sleep podcast. The podcast that will hopefully help you get to sleep. I am going to read an open source book, one that is not particularly interesting, but one that is hopefully boring enough to get you to sleep. Tonight's reading comes from The Green Bay Tree, written by Louis Bromfield and published in 1924. This story explores the life and people that live in and around the estate of Cypress Hill. My name is Teddy, and I aim to help people everywhere get a good night's rest. Sleep is so important, and my mission is to help you get the rest that you need. The podcast is designed to play in the background while you slowly fall asleep. For those new to the podcast, it started from my own struggles with sleep. I wanted to create a resource for others facing similar challenges, and I'm so grateful for the amazing community we have built together. This podcast is self-made and self-produced, which is why you will hear a short ad at the beginning of each episode. These ads, along with the support from subscribers and patrons, enable me to keep delivering this podcast for free to those who need it. Thank you to everyone who shared their words of gratitude with me during the week, whether through the website or your podcast app. Your messages mean the world to me. I would also like to thank listeners who reached out via the website. And of course, a huge thank you goes to the patrons on Patreon. Your monthly subscriptions allow me to keep bringing out more episodes for those who need them. If you find the podcast beneficial and would like to support it, there are a few ways you can contribute. Follow the podcast in your podcast app, and of course, leave a comment. You can also become a subscriber for $2.99 per month. This also removes Spotify ads and supports episode creation. If subscribing isn't possible, an easy way to help is by simply leaving a review and rating in your podcast app. Even one sentence really helps out. If you would like to support the show with a monthly contribution or simply to say hello, please visit boytosleep.com. If you know someone else out there that may benefit from a good night's sleep, you are more than welcome to share the podcast with them. In the meantime, lie back, relax, and enjoy the readings. The Green Bay Tree, a novel by Louis Bromfield. To my mother, who must have known at some time in her life, Hattie Tolliver. Life is hard for our children. It isn't as simple as it was for us. Their grandfathers were pioneers, and the same blood runs in their veins. Only they haven't a frontier any longer. They stand, these children of ours, with their backs towards this rough-hewn Middle West and their faces set toward Europe and the East, and they belong to neither. They are lost somewhere between. Every one of us is different from the others. There are no two in the least alike, and no one ever really knows anyone else. There is always a part which remains secret and hidden, concealed in the deepest part of the soul. No husband ever knows his wife, and no wife ever really knows her husband. There is always something just beyond that remains aloof and untouched, mysterious and undiscoverable, because we ourselves do not know just what it is. Sometimes it is shameful, sometimes it is too fine, too precious, ever to reveal. It is quite beyond revelation, even if we chose to reveal it. The Green Bay Tree is part of what is in a sense a single work known as Escape, which includes 3 other parts: Possession, Early Autumn, and A Good Woman. The Green Bay Tree. If you can picture a little park, bright for the moment with the flush of early summer flowers, and peopled with men and women in the costumes of the late 90s, if you can picture such a park set down in the midst of an inferno of fire, steel and smoke, there is no need to describe Cypress Hill on the afternoon of the garden party for the governor. It was a large garden, indeed quite worthy of the name park, withdrawn and shut in by high walls of arbor vitae, clipped at intervals into small niches, which sheltered bits of white statuary, some genuine, some of them copies. The Venus of Cydnos was there in copy to be sure, and of course the Apollo Belvedere, a favourite ornament of formal gardens, as well as the Samothrace Victory dashing forward, it seemed, to soar high above the cloud of smoke from the neighbouring blast furnaces. Here and there the hedge displayed signs of death. There were patches where the green had become withered, and other patches where there was no green at all, but simply a tangled wall of hard, dead twigs. Where death had touched the barrier, it was possible to see beyond the borders of the garden, into regions filled with roaring furnaces, steel sheds, and a tangle of glittering railway tracks cluttered by a confusion of semaphores and signal lights which the magic of night transformed into festoons of glowing jewels, emeralds, rubies, cabochons, opals, glowing in the thick darkness. But it was not dark yet, and no one at the garden party peered through the dying gaps in the hedge, because by daylight there lay beyond the borders of the garden only ugliness of the most appalling nature. The little park sloped away on all sides from a great brick house, conceived in the most bizarre union of Georgian and Gothic styles. It was large and square, and faced with white stone, but beyond this the Georgian style played no part. The roof carried a half-dozen high-pitched gables. The windows were tall and pointed in the manner of a church rectory, and the chimneys, built of white stone, were carved in the most ornate Gothic fashion. Over all clambered a mass of vines, woodbine, Virginia creeper, and wisteria, which somehow bound the grotesque combination of styles into one harmonious whole, characterized by a surprising look of age, considering the fact that the house stood in the midst of a community which less than a century before had been a complete and trackless wilderness. The vines, like the hedge, had been more green and exotic at some earlier day. In some places there were no leaves at all, and elsewhere, though the season was early summer, the leaves appeared sickly and wretched, surrounded by dead bare tendrils, pressing desperately against the faded bricks. On the whole, however, the garden was at its best, Along the gravel walks leading to the arbour, irises raised crowns of mauve, royal purple and yellow. Peonies in the process of bursting from tight green buds into great pom-poms of pink and white tumbled across the flagged wall. At the feet of the flying Eros, made of cast iron and painted white, who carried a ring in one hand and thus served for a hitching post, ground pinks and white violets, brought from England by Julia Shane's grandmother, peeped from among the blades of new grass. But the greatest splendour had its being in the wisteria, high up among the branches of the dead oak that towered gauntly above the horse block. Its cascades of mauve and white and purple poured like water escaping from a broken dam. From the black iron portico tumbled more torrents of blossoms. They appeared even high up among the tips of the pointed cypresses, which gave the house its name. To be sure, these were not true cypresses at all, for true cypresses could not have survived the harsh northern winter. In reality, they were cedars, but their tall, green-black spires, swaying in melancholy fashion at the least breath of air, resembled cypresses as one brother resembles another. John Shane, perhaps, because the name roused memories of some secret world of his own, always called them cypresses, and such, to all purposes, they had become. None knew why he called the house Cypress Hill, or why he loved cypresses so much that he called cedars by that name, when nature cheated him out of his heart's desire. The town set it down simply as another one of his eccentricities. One more craziness no longer disturbed the town, and John Shane had been dead now for more than 10 years, so perhaps the matter was one of no importance whatever. Under the wistarias on the wrought iron piazza, his widow, Julia Shane, leaning on her stick of ebony filigreed in silver, surveyed the bright garden and the guests who moved about among the old trees, the men clad in sober black, the ladies in sprigged muslins or bright-coloured linens. She was a tall, thin woman, with a nose slightly hooked, which gave her the fleeting look of an eagle, courageous, bold, even a little pitiless and unrelenting. An air of dignity and distinction compensated the deficiencies of beauty. She was certainly not a beautiful woman, and her fine skin was already crisscrossed by a million tiny lines no more substantial than a cobweb. Like the women of the generation preceding hers, she made no attempt at preserving the illusion of youth. Although she could not have been long past middle age, she dressed as an old woman. She wore a gown of black and mauve of the most expensive materials, a sign of mourning which kept up for her husband dead 10 years, a husband whose passing could have given her no cause for regret, whose memory could not possibly bring to her ivory cheeks the faintest flush of pleasure. But the black and mauve gave her great dignity and a certain melancholy beauty. On her thin fingers she wore rings set with amethysts and diamonds, and about her neck hung a chain of amethysts caught in a setting of old Spanish silver. The chain reached twice about her thin throat and hung to the knees. She had been standing on the piazza, a little withdrawn from her guests, all the afternoon because she knew that the mauve of her gown and the dull lavender sparkle of the amethyst blended superbly with the tumbling blossoms of the wisteria. She had not been, after all, the wife of John Shane, for nothing. People said that he had taught his wife to make the best of herself, because he could bear to have about him only those things which were in excellent taste. From her point of vantage, her bright blue eyes swept the garden, identifying the guests, those whom she desired to have there, those to whose presence she was completely indifferent, and those whom political necessity had forced upon her. About most of them centered, scornful, bitter, little thoughts that chased themselves round and round her tired brain. Over against the hedge on the far side of the little pavilion stood a group which, it appeared, interested her more than any other, for she watched it with a faint smile that carried the merest trace of mockery. She discerned the black of the bombazine worn by Hattie Tolliver, her blood niece, and the sprigged muslin of Hattie's daughter, Ellen, who stood by resentfully with an air of the most profound scorn, while her mother talked to Judge Weissman. The mother talked volubly, exerting all her power to charm the judge, and the efforts of Hattie Tolliver, so solid, so respectable, so downright, were completely transparent, for the woman possessed no trace of subtlety, not the faintest power of dissimulation. She sought to win favour with them because he was one of the most powerful in country politics. He ruled his party with an undisputed sway, and Hattie Tolliver's husband was a candidate for the office. Perhaps from the pinnacle of her worldliness, Julia Shane detected a quality naive and almost comic in the vulgar intrigue progressing so blatantly on the opposite side of the pavilion. There was also a quality indescribably comic in the fierce attitude of the daughter, in her aloofness from the politician, and the intensity of her glowering expression. She was an obnoxious child of 16, wilful, spoiled, savage, but beyond the possibility of denial. She played the piano superbly, in a true extraordinary fashion. Presently, Julia Shane, behind the shelter of the wisteria, sniffed suddenly as though the wind had carried to her, among the delicate odours of the flowers, the offensive smell of the judge. He was there by political necessity, because the governor desired his presence. Clearly she looked upon him as an intruder, who defiled the little park. Farther off at the side of the empty kennels, all buried beneath a tangle of vines, another group had gathered about a table, where pink ices and pink and white cakes were being served. About the great silver punch bowl hung a dozen men, drinking, 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 as though the little park were a corner saloon, and the little table the accustomed free lunch. For a moment Julia Shane's gaze fastened upon the men and her thin nostrils quivered. Her lips formed themselves to utter a word, which she spoke quite loudly, so that 3 women, perfect strangers to her who stood just beneath the piazza, overheard it and spread the story that Julia had taken to talking to herself. Pigs, she said. In other parts of the garden, the bright parasols of the gossiping women raised themselves in little clumps like mushrooms, appearing unexpectedly through the green of a wide lawn. The governor was nowhere to be seen, nor Lily, nor Irene, Julia Shane's 2 daughters. The guests began to depart. A Victoria with a driver on the box came round the corner of the old house, A fat dowager, dressed in purple and wearing a gold chain, bowed, and the diminutive young man beside her, in a very tight coat and a derby hat, smiled politely, very politely. Mrs. Julius Harrison and her son Willie, of the great family which owned the mills. Julia Shane bowed slightly, and leaned more heavily upon her ebony stick. A second vehicle appeared, this time a high buggy which bore the county auditor and his wife, common people who never before had entered the wrought iron gates of Cypress Hill. The fat and blousy wife bowed in an exaggerated fashion, never stopping the while to fan her red face vigorously, until she discovered that her elaborate bows were extended upon the back of Julia Shane, who had become suddenly absorbed in the rings that glittered on her bony fingers. The smile froze on the fat lady's face, and her heavy lips pursed themselves to utter, with a savage intensity of feeling, the word snob. Instead, her indignation so mounted under the protests of her tipsy husband, that a moment later she altered the epithet to another more vulgar and more powerful phrase. "How promiscuous," she said aloud. The two carriages made their way down the long avenue between the rows of dying Norway spruce to the gate where Henry stood on guard. Outside, with faces pressed against the bars, stood a score of aliens from the hovels of the mill workers in the neighbouring flats. The little group included a dozen women wearing shawls and a multitude of petticoats, 3 or 4 children, and as many half-grown boys still a year or two too young to be of any use to the Harrison mills. They pushed and pressed against the handsome gates, striving for a glimpse at the spectacle of the bright garden animated by the figures of the men and women who ruled the town, the flats, the very lives and destinies of the little throng of aliens. A baby squalled in the heat, and one of the boys, a tall, powerful fellow with a shock of yellow hair, spat through the bars. At the approach of the carriage, the Black Henry sprang up, and with the gesture of one opening the gates of Buckingham Palace, shouted to the crowd outside, "Look out, you all, there's carriages a-coming." Then with a great clanging and shooting of bolts, he swung open the gates, and Mrs. Julius Harrison and her son William swept through. The hoofs of the dancing horses beat a tattoo on the cobblestones. The mother saw nothing, but the narrow eyes of her son appraised the group of boys, and even the babies as potential workers in the mills. These children grew rapidly, but not fast enough to keep pace with the needs of the growing furnaces, and many of them did not survive to reach manhood. As the carriage swung into narrow Halstead Street, Mrs. Harrison, leaning forward so that the gold chain swayed like a pendulum from her mountainous bosom, surveyed the wretched houses, the yards bereft of all green, and the shabby railway station that stood 100 yards from the very gates of Shane's castle. "You would think Julia Shane would move out of the filthy district," she said. "Sentiment is all right, but there's such a thing as running it into the ground. The smoke and soot is even killing the flowers. They're not half so fine as last year." Her son William shrugged his narrow, sloping shoulders. "The ground is worth its weight in gold," he said. 3 railroads, the only sight left. She could get her own price. In the corner saloon, A mechanical piano set up a tinny uproar, and shattered fragments of the Blue Danube drifted out upon the hot air through the swinging doors into the street, throttling for the moment any further conversation. The county auditor and his wife drove uncertainly through the gates, for the county auditor had drunk too much and failed to understand that horses driven with crossed reins do not respond according to any preconceived plan. His wife, her face red as a ripe tomato, took them from him and swore. "She needn't think she's so damned swell," she said. "What's she got to make her so proud? I should think she'd blush at what has happened in that rotten old house. Why, she's got nothing but hunkies and dagos for neighbours." She cut the horses across the back, dashed forward and past the Victoria of Mrs. Harrison and her son William at the triumphant gallop. With a loud officious bang, Henry closed the wrought iron gates, and the wise old faces of the alien women pressed upon once more against the bars. One of the throng, the big boy with the shock of yellow hair, a Ukrainian named Stefan Kirilenko, shouted something in Russian as the gates banged together. It was a tongue of foreign to Henry, but from the look in the fierce blue eye of the young fellow, he understood what he had said was not friendly. The women admonished the boy and fell to whispering in awe amongst themselves, but the offender in no way modified his manner. When Judge Weissman, fat and perspiring and covered with jewellery, whirled past him in a phaeton a moment later, the boy shouted in Russian. Judge Weissman regarded the boy with his pop eyes, wiped his mahogany face, and muttered to his companion, Lawyer Briggs, "These foreigners are getting too free with their manners. The Harrisons will have trouble at the mills one of these days." The judge was angry, although his anger was stirred not by the shout of Stefan Kirilenko, but by the fact that Julius Shane had become suddenly blind as his phaeton swept round the corner of the old house. The shout was something upon which to fasten his anger. From her point of vantage on the wisteria-clad piazza, the old woman watched the little drama at the entrance to the park, and when the gates had flung closed once more, she moved back into the cool shadows, still wondering where Lily and Irene and the governor could have hidden themselves. She settled herself on an iron bench, praying that no one would pass to disturb her, and at the same moment the sound of sobbing reached her ears. It came from the inside of the house, from the library just beyond the tall window. There in a corner beyond the great silver-mounted globe, Irene had flung herself down and was weeping. The half-suppressed sobs shook the girl's frail body. Her muslin dress with the blue sash was crushed and damp. The mother bent over her and drew the girl into a sitting posture, against the brocade of the rosewood sofa. "Come, Irene," said the old woman. "It is no time for tears. There is time enough when this infernal crowd is gone. What is it? What has come over you since yesterday?" The girl's sobs grew more faint, but she did not answer nor raise her head. She was frail and blonde, with wide blue eyes set far apart. Her thick hair was done low at the back of her neck. She had a small pretty mouth and a rather prominent nose. Her mother must have resembled her before she hardened into a cynical old woman. Before the prominent nose became an eagle's beak, and the small pretty mouth a thin-lipped sardonic one, the mother, puzzled and silent, sat stiffly beside the sobbing girl. "Are you tired?" she asked presently. "No." "Then what is it, Irene? There must be some reason. Girls don't behave like this for nothing. What have you done that has made you miserable?" "Nothing," sobbed the girl. "Nothing." The mother sat up a little straighter and began to trace her ebony stick the outlines of the roses on the Aubusson carpet. At length she spoke again in a clear, hard voice. "Then you must pull yourself together and come out. I want you to find Lily and the governor. Everyone is leaving and they should be here. There's no use in giving a party for him if he is going to snub the politicians. Here, sit up. Turn round while I fasten your hair." With perfect deliberation, the mother arranged the girl's hair, smoothed the crumpled muslin of her dress, patted straight the blue ribbon sash, dried her eyes, and bade her stand away to be surveyed. "Now," she said in the same crisp voice, "you look all right. I can't have you behaving like this. You should be out in the garden. Before I die, Irene, I want to see you married. You never will be if you hide yourself where no one can see you. I don't worry over Lily. She can take care of herself. Go and find them and bring them back. Tell them I said to return at once." The girl, without a word, went out of the room into the big dark hallway, and thence into the garden. Her mother's voice was one made to command. It was seldom that anyone refused to carry out her orders. When Irene reached the terrace, the guests were making their way back toward the house in little groups of 2 or 3, ladies in summer dresses very tight at the waist, shielding their complexions from the June sun with small, bright-coloured parasols. Mrs. Mills, the rector's wife, Miss Bird, the town librarian, Mrs. Smythe, wife of the Methodist clergyman, Mrs. Milliken, wife of the sheriff, Miss Abercrombie, Mrs., and behind them, the husbands and the stray politicians, who treated the little arbour over the punch bowl as though it were a corner saloon. The punch was gone now, and the last of the pink ices melted. From other parts of the garden, more guests made their way toward the house. Irene passed them, bowing and forcing herself to smile through the effort brought her a kind of physical pain. Among the rhododendrons she came upon a little terracotta Virgin and Child, brought by father from Siena, and remembering her convent training, she paused for a moment and breathed a prayer. Lily and the governor were not among the rhododendrons. She ran on to the little pavilion beyond the iris walk. It was empty. The arbour, green with the new leaves of the Concord grapes, was likewise untenanted save the shadows of the sombre, tall cypresses. The girl ran on and on from the one spot of shelter to another, distracted and terrified, her muslin dress soiled and torn by the twigs. The little park grew empty, and the shadows cast by the setting sun sprawled across the patches of open grass. 2 hiding places remained, but these Irene avoided. One was the clump of bushes far down by the iron gates. She dared not go there because the little crowd of aliens peering through the bars terrified her. Earlier in the afternoon she had wandered there to be alone, and a big tow-headed boy shouted at her in broken English, There are people's bones hidden in your cellar. No, she dared not again risk the torment of his shouting. The other hiding place was the old well behind the stables, a well abandoned now and almost lost under a tangle of clematis. There was a sheltered seat by its side. The girl ran as far as the stables and then, summoning her strength to lie to her mother if the necessity arose, turned back without looking and hastened across the garden towards the piazza. She had not the courage to approach the well, because she knew that it was there she would find her sister Lily and the governor. When Irene entered the house, she found her mother in the drawing room, seated alone. The guests had all departed, and the old woman was smoking, a pleasure she had denied herself until the last of the visitors were gone. No one in the town had ever seen her smoke. It was well enough to smoke at Biarritz or Monte Carlo. Smoking in the town was another matter. Julia Shane smoked quietly, and with a certain elegance of manner which removed from the act all trace of vulgarity. She sat in a corner of the big room, near one of the tall windows which stood open a little way, admitting ghostly fragments of scent, now of iris, now of wisteria, now of lilac. Sometimes there penetrated for a second the acrid tang of soot and gas from the distant furnaces. The diamonds and amethysts on her thin fingers glittered in the fading light. She was angry, and the unmistakable sounds of her anger were present. The flash in her bright blue eye, the slight trembling of the veined hands. The ebony stick rested by her side. As Irene entered, she did not move or shift for a second the expression of her face. And that concludes tonight's readings. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this story. I also hope you're feeling a little drowsy. If you're not quite tired yet, please feel free to listen to another episode of the Boy to Sleep podcast. Until next time, good night.